We are here for a wonderful session today on adventure sports. I'm sure this workshop is something that all of us have been looking forward at because this is a workshop that we have never ever explored because there are so many lovely things that we can do in India and there's so much of adrenaline rush that we can experience, but somehow we miss doing that. And to ensure that we know the right things about the right adventure sports, we have an amazing resource person with us, Mr. Rahul Jaina. So, I would like to introduce this wonderful personality because his achievements on adventure sports have been out of the box. I mean, you can't even think of it. So, Rahul Jaina is actually a lawyer by profession, and he's had an extensive experience in working as a legal consultant for multinational companies, various law firms, startups, as well as in private legal practice. In fact, Rahul has also been involved in so many adventure sports industry for over a decade in India and abroad. He's trained in scuba diving, in paragliding, in river rafting, kayaking, skiing, trekkings and various expeditions, skydiving, microlight and ultralight flights, and the list just goes on. So this passion for outdoors and adventures led Rahul to start his adventure travel business named Adventure Spear. Adventure Spear promoted curated experience and tours in various locations across India and South Asia with a focus on adventure activities and ecotourism based on a sustainable and environmentally responsible model in partnership with the local communities. Adventure Spear has a full range of tours built around on various adventure activities, trekking and expeditions, scuba diving, paragliding, skiing, snowboarding, mountain biking, motorcycle tours, wildlife and birding tours, cultural and tribal tours, and the list just goes on. Further, Adventure Spear is involved in legal and advocacy efforts related to ecotourism and adventure travel, together with various industry bodies, including the Sikkim Paragliding Associations, Uttarakhand Rafting Associations, Ladakh Mountain Guides Association, and again, this list is also not ending at all. So, so Rahul is going to do a nice session for all of us where he's going to explain us about various experience and how, as a general public, we can also make use of this. So we are glad that on behalf of Decathlon Brigade Road in collaboration with Engage India, we are able to organize this workshop. So welcome Rahul on board and we are blessed to have you amongst us today. Over to you.
Hi, Bhagishi. Thank you so much, and thanks a lot to Decathlon for uh, having me on your platform. It's a great opportunity to actually have an interaction. I mean, these are things that I personally am very passionate about, and I hope there are a lot of people who might watch this are also passionate about. So since we are in a state where it's not actually possible to travel outside, it's at least good that we can, get together and interact online and, discuss some things like this. So thanks for that glowing introduction. I don't know how deserved that actually was, but thank you so much anyway. Uh, what I thought we would start with is, we have give a very basic understanding of what exactly are adventure sports, and what does adventure sports and adventure travel involve for the absolute layman. So I'd like to begin by saying that your introduction made it sound like I am an expert at a lot of these things. So let me make it very clear. I have done training in a lot of these activities, and I have significant experience spanning like a decade in a lot of these activities. But by no means am I an instructor or an expert. I'd like to say that I'm still learning, and that's usually how these activities are. I mean, you learn by doing, and the more you're able to do, the more you learn and the better you get. So of course, just like any other activity, whether it's cricket or football or martial arts, there are levels to all of these activities. So I mean, you start with your basic knowledge and experiences, and as you keep doing it more and more, then you're able to achieve higher levels and maybe take on more complex or more difficult, more challenging experiences in all of these sports. So can we please share the slide if that is I hope I'm audible, by the way. Is it possible for you to share the slide, please, or help me with the sharing the slide? Okay.
So if your slide, just open your slideshow and you can just click on share screen
Yeah.
option at the bottom
Yeah, I
and just
just,
select your screen that you need to share.
okay, got it. Is that visible?
Yeah, it's clear.
Okay, Bhagishi, thanks so much. All right, so let's have a very quick discussion on the very basics of adventure sports and adventure travel. So a lot of you might be already very well versed with some of these activities and some of the information I'm about to share. So, but do bear with me because not everyone will have all of this information with them, and it would be helpful to some people on the platform. So yeah, so firstly, what is adventure sports and what does it involve? So adventure sports essentially, I mean, there is no set definition of adventure as such. I mean, anything which involves some kind of exploration, some kind things which involve uh, a little bit of excitement and exploration and trying out new things. It literally can mean anything. So whether it's related to arts or whether it's related to food or whether it's related to fashion or, so any kind of exploration of anything can really literally mean an adventure. So however, when we talk about adventure sports in the travel industry, usually there are a lot of different activities which people tend to consider as adventure activities. Now, of course, this list that you can see on the screen is by no means a comprehensive list. There are a lot of other activities, maybe bungee jumping or zip lining or rappelling or canyoning. So there are a lot of other activities also which people consider as adventure activities. But by and large, these are the kind of activities that are taken to mean adventure sports in the travel industry, so to speak. And and these are the sort of activities which have a lot of depth to it. So, for instance, a bungee jump is an experience where you are put on a platform and then or a bridge, or you're taken up on a crane and you have a jump attached to the bungee rope, and that's sort of the extent of your experience. There's a big adrenaline rush and a lot of thrill attached to it, but that's sort of what the experience is like. These activities that I'm going to talk about, they're much more involved, much more some of them are very technical, and in fact the list of activities that are here, some of them you can broadly divide it into two sort of groups. The first one is those activities where to be able to do it you would require some kind of training, some level of training, and sometimes even certification. So you won't be able to do it without certification. And the others are some which you don't require any certification or training to do it. For instance, scuba diving is something that you will need a certification to do, whereas trekking is something that you don't need any certification. Basically, anyone can go on a trek. So yeah, so we'll very quickly just go through these activities and then we can talk about some of them in detail also. So let's start with scuba. Uh, Scuba diving, everyone knows what scuba diving is. It's basically exploring the underwater environment with your scuba gear. Scuba basically means self-contained underwater breathing apparatus. So you have your entire set of scuba gear and you're able to stay underwater for a significant amount of time, sometimes stretching for hours, and that enables you to explore underwater regions, and basically which is literally very different from anything that you see above the surface of the water. So the whole purpose of having that scuba gear is to enable you to spend as much time as possible underwater and at varying depths as well. So scuba, it's possible to do a introductory scuba dive with a trained scuba diver who will quickly show you, give you some basic training and preparation, and then take you on a guided tour of a short guided tour up to a limited amount of depth, say around 12 to 15 meters, for maybe half an hour or so that you get an understanding and feel of what it feels like to be underwater, and more importantly, what it feels like to breathe through your mouth from a tank of air rather than breathing through your nose when you're out in the at the surface. So that's how you can kind of begin to, it's you under the PADI system, it's called a Discover Scuba Dive. The other way for you to dive by yourself is to do a scuba course. So there are various grades, basic, advanced, rescue, dive master, as you can see. So if you do a basic and an advanced course, you can actually dive literally at any dive site in the world, as long as you go to uh, uh, a, a registered dive shop. So the basic and advanced course together would take around 8 to 10 days to do. And it enables you to dive to a depth of 30 meters or 100 feet, which is the limit for recreational diving. So what do you do when you go underwater? If you do the basic course, just for information, if you do the basic course, you are allowed to dive to a depth of 18 to 20 meters. Whereas in the advanced course, you're taught a further level of skill, such as navigation underwater, or going deeper underwater, or photography underwater, or diving at night, or there are different skills that you learn in the advanced course, and you can dive to 30 meters. So literally in the entire world, you can go up to any dive shop, you can show your diving card, and you can dive at whatever dive shop you're, wherever it is. So the whole idea, like I said, of scuba diving is to explore. I mean, if you're interested in seeing the amazing fish life and various, like literally thousands of species of fish and various other sea creatures, whether it's turtles or sharks or octopus or anemone and things like that. So variety of ship life. Then there are wrecks. There are large number of shipwrecks scattered in the oceans of the world, and some of them are at a depth where if you have the requisite training, you can dive at these wrecks also. To do this course, it's you either have the PADI system or the CMAS system. PADI is like the most widely prevalent one around the world. So if you do a PADI course anywhere in India, you can take your PADI certification card and go to any PADI dive shop in the world, wherever it is in the world, and you can dive with them. So as you start increasing the levels, you could do the dive master course as well. Now the dive master course allows you to lead dives. You don't need to go to a dive shop. If you have your own tank and you're a dive master, you're competent enough to dive yourself. Of course, the rule in diving is that you never dive alone, no matter how advanced of a level you are, because it's called the buddy system, where it's always two people who are diving together at least, just in case of emergencies and difficult situations which might arise underwater. So yeah, so in India, Andamans, Lakshadweep, Goa, Pondicherry, Chennai, these are like the best places to dive. I did my courses in Andamans a long time back, and it was an amazing experience. Very recently, I got a chance to dive in Pondicherry and Chennai for the first time, and it was quite fantastic. The water was this was in fact just a little bit before the lockdown, so it was towards the tail end of winters, and the water was amazing. The fish life was amazing. I was very impressed with how beautiful it was, and I didn't actually think that the waters would be that lovely and that clear, and the fish life would be that beautiful and that abundant in Pondicherry and Chennai itself. So yeah, and as far as the rest of the world is concerned, places like Indonesia, Malaysia, Philippines, Australia, these are Great Barrier Reef. Everybody has heard of the Great Barrier Reef. It's like one of the largest reef systems in the world. Unfortunately, right now it's suffering a lot of environmental damage, but yeah, so these are the places where we have some of the best diving in the world. And surprisingly, the Red Sea, Egypt, the Red Sea in Egypt has some of the absolute best diving in the world, and it's very famous for its wrecks. There are a lot of wrecks from the World War II era in that along the coast of Egypt, and the waters there are incredibly clear, and they have amazing fish life as well. So yeah, that's pretty much like the basics, the bare basics of scuba diving. So I intend to kind of go on like this about the other activities as well. So yeah, the next one, paragliding and skydiving. They basically both involve a parachute. Where they differ is that during skydiving, you jump out of a plane and you open your parachute and you land back down on Earth. It's basically all about that free fall that you achieve when you jump out of a plane. It's possibly the most thrilling, biggest adrenaline rush you can get. At least that for me, I have only done one. I have only had one skydiving experience in my life, and that was in South Africa in Cape Town. And I can honestly say that I have never had a bigger adrenaline rush than that skydive. However, the reason that I kind of didn't uh, get into skydiving more is because in the meantime I did my paragliding training in Kamshet in Pune, and I found paragliding to be far more engaging and involved activity, because paragliding literally is the closest that human beings will come to kind of flying like a bird. So the difference between a skydive and paragliding is, a paragliding you're able to soar in the air like a bird for literally as long as you want, or you're able to, or the weather conditions will permit. So a paraglider is it's called a glider or a wing, and it's attached to a harness which you sit inside the harness, and you control the glider with the control wires and the brakes. And the basically the default state of that uh, glider is kind of similar to a parachute. Now, if a parachute opens, it's going to descend to Earth. Similarly, with the paraglider, it's going to descend to Earth. So how you fly a paraglider is that you have to catch the air, which will push you up. So in whatever terrain you are flying, whichever region you are flying, there will be some places where the air is going upwards, which is called a lift zone, and then some places where the air is going downwards, which is called a drop zone. So the more you stay in a lift zone, the more altitude you gain, and the more you're able to stay in the air. When you move away from a lift zone and enter a drop zone, your glider automatically starts descending at a steady rate. So the idea is to circle around those lift zones and stay in the air, and that's how you're able to, literally fly for hours at a stretch. Yeah, so coming to the courses, APPI is the body that does the courses. So for the most basic level of sorry, for the most basic level of flying, you would have to do the first three courses. They're called P1, P2, P3, and that will kind of enable you to soar in the air for at least fair amount of time. But usually what happens is, when you just start with your soaring, you have to do it with instructions from experienced pilots or instructors on the ground, because they will be able to guide you on how you should maneuver, where you should go, when to land, how to orient yourself, where the drop zone is, where the lift zone is, and also most importantly regarding the traffic, because there might be other gliders in the air as well. So when you start learning, you're always under radio instructions from the ground, and slowly, as you, like I said, most of these activities you have to keep doing them to pick them up and become better at it. So as you keep doing it, then you don't rely on a ground instructions from the ground anymore, as you get more and more experience. And of course, then there are many more advanced levels, just like in scuba, where you can fly along coasts, where you can take off at planes. Some more advanced level would be where you go to very high altitudes, maybe 4,000 meters, 5,000 meters even, and then jump off from a mountain or a cliff from that altitude also. Then there is cross-country flying, where you can literally fly maybe 200, 300, 400 kilometers uh, across country at higher altitudes and just land. So eventually, as my instructor would love telling us, that when you get better at these activities, you can just put your glider in your car, you drive off to some place, unpack your glider, take off, fly, land, just pack your glider, put it in your car again, and then drive back home. So that's kind of what it is. And believe me, it's a very different feeling when you're literally flying like a bird in the sky. And the principles of flying a paraglider are so unique, because it's kind of exactly the principles that a bird would use to fly in the air, except the bird has the ability to power itself with its wings, whereas in a glider you have to just use the air conditions and the wind conditions to stay in the air. Yeah. So some of the places where they have skydiving in India, and the thing with skydiving in India is it's not a very well developed industry. So uh, I mean, at different points of time, they've had it at Mysore, Hyderabad, Pondicherry, and Maharashtra. And to be very honest, like I said, I've only had the experience of skydiving once in my life, so I'm not too certain of the skydiving courses and the instructors in India right now. Of course, there are a lot of countries outside where you will find many instructors and many schools which teach you skydiving, especially places like New Zealand and Australia, Bali, and South Africa, and a lot of places in Europe as well, Switzerland especially. As far as paragliding goes, there are hundreds of paragliding spots in the world to choose from. Kamshet in Pune, where I did my courses, is generally considered to be the best place to do your courses, but there are equally good schools in other parts of the country as well. Bir Billing is a very famous paragliding spot in Himachal. There's paragliding in a lot of paragliding in the northeast. There's paragliding in Uttarakhand. There's a lot of paragliding in Himachal as well, Solang, Manali, etc. Right. So moving on to the next one, skiing and snowboarding. Skiing and snowboarding is an activity where you have to have training, but you don't always need a certification. Just to recap, for paragliding to be able to fly a solo flight, anyone who is willing can go on a tandem flight with a tandem pilot, and that will be a tandem ride for a certain period of time, which I'm sure everyone has seen. Especially maybe one or two videos online you might have seen of people doing tandem paragliding flights. Whereas to be able to fly, of course, you'll need the training and the certification, fly solo flights. Yeah. So now moving on to skiing and snowboarding. So skiing and snowboarding is not something where you will always need a certification, but you definitely need to be trained, because it's the movement when you're skiing on a slope in snow is very fast, and if you go out of control, then you can cause serious harm and injury to yourself and to others. So you definitely need training. And how you start is so basically there are two kinds of skiing, alpine and Nordic. And alpine skiing basically comes from the word Alps, obviously. So it's basically downhill skiing at faster rates, and you might have seen events like slalom and giant slalom, which is basically what alpine skiing is. So it's all about going fast and negotiating those turns and the ridges along those steeper slopes. Whereas Nordic skiing comes from Scandinavia. It's basically Scandinavian countries are hundreds of kilometers of snow pretty much the entire year, maybe in some cases. So it's far easier for them to travel cross country on ski rather than walking in the snow. So Nordic skiing is basically cross country skiing, and we are very lucky that in India we have an opportunity to do both. So there are the institutes that are mentioned here. You will get your skiing courses. You can do your skiing courses, and there are 3-4 very good ski resorts in the country. In fact, the world over, there are skiers from all over the world who want to come and ski in the Himalayas as well, especially places like Gulmarg, which are world famous now and getting a lot of attention. Yeah. So yeah, that's kind of the basics of skiing. So how we we as a company, how we do say a cross country trip would be, you will go along with a guide and an instructor on a multi-day skiing trip where you'll traverse the snow. It can be a single day trip, it can be a multi-day trip where you'll traverse the snow on skis, and you of course have to have some basic training before you can go large distances. But yeah, so you go and you stop at a place, you camp for the night, you rest up for the night. Then the next morning you break camp, you pack up everything. You will have the team who will be carrying everything with them on either sleds or on backpacks, and the instructor or guide will be guiding you through the terrain and the hills, and you go skiing. And this can last for maybe 2 days, 3 days, maybe even longer trips, right? Skiing and snowboarding, that's kind of the basics of that. Rafting and kayaking. So I'm pretty sure everybody's aware what rafting and kayaking is. So rafting trips are usually on, the raft is large, so it can accommodate a lot of people. And the main guy who will be piloting the raft is the pilot or guide. The raft is usually the inflatable raft. And the idea is to go through these fast moving rivers and rapids, and, get a chance to see this amazing scenery while you're on the river, especially in the hills, or if you're in the jungles and you have a chance to, and if the river is fast enough. So the bigger the rapid, the bigger the thrill, obviously. But of course, there are always levels, like I said, with everything. Whatever we've discussed thus far, in fact, with scuba, with paragliding, with skiing and snowboarding, and with rafting, kayaking. So there are levels to everything. It's like I said, the more you do, the better you can get at it. But believe me, it's very difficult to jump from, say, level 1 to level 4 straight away. And sometimes it might not be safe also. So everything has levels, and it usually makes sense for a person to go through the levels as they gain more experience at each different level. So you don't have to be trained at all to go on a river rafting trip. And a river rafting trip can be one day, which goes for 10 kilometers, 20 kilometers, 30 kilometers, or it can be a 2-day trip, 3-day trip, maybe a week to 10-day trip also, if that's what that's the kind of trip you want. So usually you will have the pilot. He will give you the basic instructions. He will guide you while you're on the raft. You'll have to wear the protective gear, like the helmets and the life jackets, obviously, as like it's shown here. And this is actually the rafting on the Ganga in the winter. So the water is very cold. So in which case you'll have to wear, something like a wetsuit or a dry suit or something like that, right? So yeah, so the pilot will usually tell you exactly when to go, if everyone's supposed to row at the same time, or if the guys on the left, or the people on the left are supposed to row, or people on the right are supposed to row, depending on which direction you want your raft to move. And usually what happens is, when you're just about to enter a rapid, that's when everyone has to row as fast as they can, so that they carry the maximum amount of momentum while they're about to enter the rapid. Because once you're in the rapid, there's nothing you can do. It's the river which is going to carry you, uh, along its own path. So the idea is to have the maximum amount of momentum when you're entering the rapid, so that you cross that rapid that quickly, and your boat, your raft is sort of the direction and momentum of your raft takes you along the course of the river itself, and not to the to left or right, something like that. Where rafting differs from kayaking is that kayaking is an individual activity, and you have to be trained to be kayaking in rivers and rapids. Sea kayaking, so essentially there are two different kinds of kayaks. What you use in the rivers and rapids is a closed-off kayak, which you have to be trained in to be going on the rivers. Whereas the sea kayaks are usually open kayaks, where you don't need to be trained. As long as you're reasonably comfortable in the water and you know how to row, you can do sea kayaking. There are certain small exceptions to that, but that's generally how it works. So rafting is where you are in a larger raft, which with a team essentially, and kayak is you're on your own. So for kayaking, you have to be fully trained so that you understand the course of the river and the water and the obstacles, and you know how to orient your kayak depending on the water conditions, the rocks, or whatever obstacles that come in the way, and the flow of the water, how much depth there is in the water, what is the speed of the flow, what is the speed of the flow of the water, and things like that. Whereas in a raft, since you're sitting as a team and you have a pilot or a guide with you, it's much there is no training required. Some basic instruction is good enough. So you can do kayaking training, especially the most popular places to do kayaking training are around Rishikesh and Devprayag. This is the Ganga River. And the famous rivers in India, again, we are very lucky to be in this part of the world, because there are a lot of these amazing rivers near the Himalayas, where you have fantastic white water. When you talk about rafting, it's basically the white water which gets people excited. So Zanskar River in Ladakh, Ganga, Tons River in Uttarakhand, Beas in Himachal. So there are a lot of this Kaming River in Arunachal as well. So there are a lot of rivers where you get great whitewater to raft. And again, there's Nepal and Bhutan also very close by, which have some amazing rivers to raft on as well. Rafting to raft and kayak on. Yeah. What there's also multi-day rafting trips where you can have, like I was saying earlier, you can have a 5-day, 1 week, 8-day, 10-day rafting trips where you are in your team is in a raft with the pilot, and the support team with all your tents, your food, your utensils, your extra clothes and things like that, with all the luggage and whatever you require on an rafting expedition like this, they will follow in a separate raft with all the material, and you will be rafting as a team with your pilot, whereas the support staff will be carrying all this and rafting along with you. And there is always supposed to be a safety kayaker which accompanies every raft, which kind of goes ahead of every raft to make sure that river conditions are okay. And once it's passed through each section of the river, it signals back to the pilot on the raft to say that, okay, this part of the river is fine, and then you are supposed to follow it. So what happens is, when you're on one of these multi-day trips, the support team, which is the instructors or guides team, they will you raft a certain section of the river for the day, say whatever it is, 20 kilometers, 30 kilometers, whatever your distance you've gone. You stop next to the river wherever where you're permitted to, and where there is a decent enough place to, you stop along the river, you set up camp, you spend the night there, you have your food and you sleep in your tent. You get up in the morning, you pack up everything, the support raft moves off, then the safety kayak moves off, then you move off in your raft, and so on and so forth. So it's like an amazing way to kind of explore an entire river, really. So multi-day rafting trips can even be like 10 to 12 days, and like I said, Tons River, Zanskar, Kameng, these are some of the famous ones in India. Mashandi and Kali Gandaki are these mighty rivers which are just cutting through the Himalayas in Nepal. They also have amazing opportunity for multi-day trips. And the Zambezi River in Africa is sort of the most famous out of all of these rivers for whitewater. Yeah, so that's kind of covered rafting and kayaking. One last thing about rafting, though, is that there's a lot of safety which needs to be taken care of. It's just like with every other activity we've been talking about. Things like scuba and paragliding, you are anyway always conscious of the safety aspects, because you're taking that training, and from day one, you have to be conscious of these things. Firstly, there is theory involved in both of them. So you have to understand the mechanics and the physics and the science behind how people can remain underwater for so long, or how they can soar in the sky for so long. So you are always conscious of these matters when you're doing the courses. But for instance, on a rafting trip or on a tandem paragliding trip, where a tandem pilot is taking you on a short ride, or on a Discover Scuba sort of dive, where a dive master is holding your hand, and after taking you on a dive, you need to know the safety aspects involved, so that you can always kind of understand that the guide or the instructor is competent enough, certified, competent enough, experienced enough, and has the right temperament to take you on on one of these activities. Because accidents do happen, unfortunately, especially in rafting. There's like enough data out there to show that over the years there have been a large number of deaths as well, injury as well, for a variety of reasons. I mean, drowning is just one of them. I mean, a lot of the time, even heart attacks cause a number of deaths in the rafting industry. So it's always good to kind of find the right people. for instance, if you want to learn dance, or if you want to learn cooking, or if you want to learn karate, you try to find out who is the best instructor. Your first question in your mind is, okay, who's a good instructor for whatever skill you're trying to acquire? It's doubly important in activities such as these, because I mean, there is a lot of risk involved in fair amount of risk involved in all of them, and some of them have an extra level of risk even above that. Things like mountaineering and scuba have a lot of risk attached to them, and there are a lot of processes and SOPs which need to be followed as an individual who is engaging in any of these activities. So having the right instructor and doing that course or that training in a diligent manner is very important. Okay, so I think that about covers rafting and kayaking. Yeah, and just to sum up again on that safety point. So whenever you go to a place and you want to kind of try your first scuba dive, or you want to try your first tandem paragliding experience, or you want to try a rafting experience, it's always good to make sure that you know who is a reliable person to take you on that trip. Yeah, so next is microlight flying. This is basically what a microlight is. It's like a chassis with an engine attached to a big wing. And unlike the paraglider, which relies on wind conditions of a certain place to get airborne, this has an engine, and it relies on its engine for its lift and thrust. So it's quite an amazing experience getting on one of these, because it's open. It's literally like what I like to call is an auto rickshaw of the sky. So it's very open. You're exposed to the elements, and it's quite a very adventurous, very thrilling activity, especially if you have amazing views. So as far as I know, there is only one place that in our part of the world where you can do a microlight flying close, and that's in Pokhara in Nepal. So we have paramotor and microlight flights in different parts of the country, and it's if you don't want to do the course, which is courses like this where involved, a course like this would be a much longer, much more, it won't be a 8, 10, 15 day affair. It will be a much longer course. So just to kind of experience this on a one-off basis, there are 2 or 3 places in the country. And maybe there are other places also. I mean, these are the ones that I know of. Right. Surfing, everybody knows what surfing is. So surfing, you have a paddleboard and a surfboard. Usually you start, the whole idea behind surfing and the skill involved in surfing is achieving this balance. The balance when you are standing on the board in the waves. I mean, it's difficult enough to be in water in, where there are a lot of waves in the sea without any board. So it's that picking up getting that balance correct when you're on a surfboard, that is the difficult part. So usually what happens is to pick up that skill of the balance, you do the SUP course, which is the stand-up paddling. That's a bigger board, a broader board, and it sort of helps you build the balance. And you of course have a paddle to kind of propel yourself in the direction that you want to go. Whereas a surfboard, you don't have a paddle. You're relying only on the wave, the force of the wave to take you in the direction that you want to go. So as far as surfing goes, Mangalore, Kovalam, Chennai, Goa, there are a lot of there are enough instructors where you can learn surfing from, and you don't need a certificate. You can, if you are willing to teach yourself also, you could probably do it. I mean, assuming of course you only go into safe seas and not into very rough seas when you're starting out yourself. But yeah, there are enough instructors and surfing conditions are usually supposed to be better. I'm not a surfer myself. I don't know how to surf, but surfing conditions are supposed to be better during close to the rainy season. Of course, for more experienced surfers, the bigger the wave, the rougher the sea, it's always better. So rainy season is best for them. But closer to the rains is when you that's what the instructors say, that if you want to learn surfing, you should start sometime around closer to the rainy season, because in the winter time the seas are too calm and the probability of getting waves is limited. So it's always better to be to pick up or learn surfing closer to the rainy season. So yeah, Mangalore, Kovalam, Chennai, Goa, these are the famous surfing spots in India. Uh, Also, Sri Lanka has some of the most famous surfing spots in the world. In fact, places like Bali. I'm talking about our immediate vicinity. Uh, of course, Australia, Hawaii, New Zealand, the famous surf spots of the world, California. But in our immediate vicinity, Sri Lanka is world famous as well as Bali. So those are probably the two best options in Southeast Asia and South Asia, closer to home. Cycling and mountain biking, no need to explain. Everybody knows about this. So I'd just like to tell you a bit about how we do our cycling tours. These are the destinations, if you can see on the screen. I mean, you can do cycling and mountain biking trips and tours literally in any part of the country. There are some amazing trips to be done in Madhya Pradesh, in Rajasthan, in Goa as well, just to name a few. I mean, and mountain biking, of course, we have the Himalayas at our doorstep. So for that, we are very lucky because, of course, the best mountain biking experiences can happen in the Himalayas. Things like Manali, Leh are legendary sort of mountain biking trips. So how we do mountain biking trips is for a multi-day trip, you'll have the guide with you. I mean, you are free to bring your own cycle, or we are happy to provide cycles for you as well. And depending on what kind of cycle you're used to and what grade of cycling that you're comfortable with, you'll have a support vehicle with you, and you'll have all the spares. You'll have a mechanic, and we'll be carrying our own tents, our food, our utensils, our sleeping bags, everything on the vehicle. And on these trips, we choose like the best possible campsites or homestays or hotels or guest houses, whatever the customer is comfortable with, or whatever they want to experience. And you can always mix and match also. You stay one night at a homestay, you camp out under the stars one night you're out in a field somewhere, the other night maybe you're in an orchard or something. So it really depends, and there are a lot of great opportunities for mountain biking, long mountain biking trips all over the country, literally, like I said, and especially in the Himalayas. Yeah, so that's about it. And so mountain biking and motorbike, it's exactly the same with motorbikes. If we don't do very large group motorbike tours, because I mean, the idea when you're out on these trips shouldn't be that you're in, like, you're trying to escape a crowd and then you run into more crowds. And if it's a group of say 20, 25, 30 bikes, then it kind of takes away to from the experience, in our opinion. I mean, of course, if that's your choice and 30 people want to come, we can very well provide for that as well. And whether you want us to give you a bike or whether you want to bring your own bike, that's both equally fine. And similar to mountain biking, there'll be a support vehicle, there'll be guys to do basic repairs and overhauls along the way. And in fact, or if it's a especially high altitude region, or like parts of Himachal or Ladakh, or if Sikkim as well, or if if the weather is kind of might be a little extreme, if it's say in say around December, January, when the hills are very cold, or if it's the rainy season in places like Assam or Arunachal, where things like slush and mud and heavy rain and landslides are a factor. We also we also make sure that there is a spare rider as part of our team. The group will be led by a pilot or guide, for sure, and they will be the ones taking you through the route, similar for mountain biking, of course. And there will be a spare rider just in case you're not feeling up to it on a particular day because of whatever altitude. It could be because of altitude, or it could be maybe you're slightly under the weather one day, or maybe you have a upset stomach or something. So you can travel in the support vehicle while the spare rider takes your bike. And then when we get to the next stop, you're always free to kind of get back on your motorcycle. And believe me, we only provide the best motorcycles. We make sure that our customers are getting only the best available motorcycles, because the one constant companion on your motorcycle or cycling trip is your cycle. So if you have a problematic relationship with your motorcycle or cycle, then that kind of takes away from the entirety of your trip. So I mean, no one can guarantee that you won't have some problems along the road and along the way. But I mean, usually our idea is to kind of minimize any of those things and make sure that the customer gets the best possible experience on that trip. Yeah, fishing and angling. So, I mean, nothing to explain here much. So we do multi-day fishing trips where, so fishing in fast-running water, white water, high altitude areas where the rivers are shallow, the fish are different, things like trout or mahseer or the other smaller fish that you get in the hilly regions. There is a little bit of a instructions that you will have to get, because the baits for different fish are different. The kind of line you use for different fish are different. The kind of rod and reel you use for different fish are different. So that's the kind of basic introduction to fishing that you'll be given. And we have these multi-day fishing trips where you start walking along the riverbank. You stop at a good spot. You fish for however long you want. You're free to move to another spot if you feel like. At the end of the day, we set up camp for you, or we put you up in a homestay, or we put you up in a guest house. And next morning, we take care of everything. Basically, in fact, most of our tours work like that. It's completely end to end. So here, you stay. The food and everything is taken care of by us. We provide you with the camp equipment as well, sleeping bags and so on. And then next morning, we while the team is kind of packing up camp, you and the guide or instructor will leave for the next fishing spot. So you can have 2-day, 3-day, 4-day fishing trips like this. And the beauty of this is that terrain in all of these regions mentioned here are very different. Like Arunachal is fully jungle. It can be hot and humid, whereas Sikkim ranges from like tropical forests to sort of pine coniferous forest, and then you can go to high altitude areas as well. Similar with Uttarakhand and Himachal. And Nepal, Annapurna region has some excellent fishing spots in, again, variety of region. So does Bhutan. Small word about Bhutan. Bhutan has some of the most amazing water I've seen. It's absolutely clear water. The air and water in Bhutan is literally magical. You can feel the difference. And it's just great being around the rivers in Bhutan. And I have been to, Gangotri and a lot of these high altitude regions where I've seen ice falls and glaciers as well. But the water in Bhutan is kind of something different. There's a certain quality to it which makes it literally magical. Right. Finally, mountaineering and trekking. So mountaineering and trekking basically involves exploration of mountains. Really, a trek can mean anything. You can trek from from a desert to a desert region to a jungle region as well. But the general understanding is that it's exploring mountainous areas on by walking, literally. And mountaineering is the the activity is where you're climbing, essentially climbing mountains, but in a trained and technical manner. So some peaks, in fact, are called trekking peaks because you can simply walk up to these the summit of these peaks without any technical training. There might be, some of them are very high also. For example, Kilimanjaro is a trekking peak, the highest peak in the continent of Africa. Stok Kangni in Ladakh is a trekking peak. There are trekking peaks very close to Everest, which climbers who want to climb Everest also use to acclimatize. Whereas the really technical peaks will require mountaineering training. So only qualified mountaineers are who have the training and the certification are able to undertake these mountaineering expeditions. So there is there's a basic mountaineering course, which is I think 26 to 27 days. I'm not a trained mountaineer, even though I've been around mountains, and I love exploring mountainous areas. I've done a lot of trekking in a lot of different parts of the country, as well as in Nepal and Bhutan. Uh, but the mountaineering, the basic course is 26 days, and the advanced course is around 30 days, 26, 27, and 30 days. And they teach you the techniques, the theory, the techniques, the procedures, all the equipment, starting from your shoes to your crampons to those nails and hammers and ice axes and things like that. There are different types of climbing. There is traversing rock, there is ice climbing, then there is those climbing with the ascender, where you're attached to a rope and you have the ascender in your hand, and the ascender is attached to the harness. So there are a lot of different technical aspects involved in mountaineering. And we in India, we have some of the best mountaineering schools anywhere in the world, really. HMI and Nehru and ABV. Plus, the biggest thing with trekking and mountaineering is that we are so lucky to have the greatest mountains in the world literally at our doorstep, whether it's in India or in Nepal or in Bhutan. So we have, even Pakistan has some of the most amazing mountains of the world, if one is able to get there. And I would personally love to go and explore those areas, Nanga Parbat and K2 and Gasherbrum, Masherbrum, Broad Peak. These are some of the greatest mountains in the world. Unfortunately for us, it might be a little difficult to get there, but we still have Nepal as some of the greatest mountains in the world. And across India, from Ladakh all the way to Arunachal, there are some spectacular mountainous terrains to explore. And the beauty of the Himalayas is that they are, they literally have their own ecosystem. So each section of the Himalayas creates its own ecosystem, and within those sections also, each region within those sections has a separate kind of an ecosystem. So there is something for everybody in the Himalayas. Whatever you're interested in, you can actually have a chance of seeing in the Himalayas. So if what you want to see are like big, tall, beautiful mountains, Everest, Annapurna, Kanchenjunga, Dhaulagiri. So that's just in Nepal. I just named these mountains in Nepal. Kanchenjunga, part of it is in Sikkim as well. So Nanda Devi, Trishul. The list is endless. Stok Kangri, Sasar Kangri. These are the ones, the tall mountains. There are incredibly beautiful lakes in the Himalayas as well. Pangong and So Moriri, everybody knows. Gokyo near Everest, Guru Dongmar in North Sikkim. The Great Lakes in Kashmir, some of the most beautiful lakes, Volar and Tarsar and Marsar. Chandratal, Brahmatal, these are the famous ones, and somewhat more accessible ones in Himachal. Glaciers, Khumbu Glacier at the foot of Mount Everest, Zemu Glacier, which is equally impressive, but not too many people have heard of it, at the foot of Kanchenjunga. Gangotri, everyone knows, of course. Then the Chadar River, which is basically the Chadar River trek is on the Zanskar, where you are walking on the frozen Zanskar River. Kaligandaki in Nepal is again an incredible river which cuts through those enormous mountains and creates these amazing valleys with fabulous scenery. Plant life, animal life, and the cultural aspects as well. So there's so many different cultural aspects, starting from the Ladakh side all the way to Arunachal. So within Arunachal, in fact, for example, on the western side, you have Tawang and all those Buddhist regions, whereas on the eastern side, you have the tribal cultures of the indigenous tribes of Arunachal. So there's so much cultural, exploration that can be done in the Himalayas as well. Then, there are also a lot of these beautiful national parks around this region, which can be explored, right? So I think that kind of more or less covers it. There's a few other things I wanted to talk about if we have time. Is that okay? We have time? I'm sorry, we have some time. We have some more time. Oh, okay, great. Okay. So just to tell you a little bit about adventure, a little more about trekking. So there's various treks, depending on degree of difficulty. There can be easy treks, moderate treks, and hard treks. Easy treks is where the trail is well defined. You walk only maybe 2 to 4 hours a day, and at the end of the day, you're reasonably sure you'll get a place to stay. You'll get some hot food to eat. That's what you would characterize as an easy trek. The altitude will not be too high. Moderate trek is where the walks per day are longer, maybe 5 hours, 6 hours, where the accommodation and things like that will be basic, or you'll have to camp out entirely, where you might not get a chance to rest a lot. There might be some parts of the trail which are very steep, some parts of the trail which are very steep going down. So your ascent and descent keeps going up, which makes it more tiring. Things like that. And harder treks usually are the ones where your ascent descent are extremely high, and usually you're covering higher altitude and more difficult trails, where the trails sometimes you maybe even have to look for the trail, especially if it has snowed freshly, and there probably will not be place to stay. You'll have to camp, you'll have to carry all your equipment with you as a team. So that's what you call a harder trek. In India, usually we don't have a tea house trekking culture till now. It's kind of coming up in some places. Nepal traditionally has had a very well developed tea house trek, because what used to happen was the trekkers used to just walk from one village in that particular region of Nepal, whether it's the Everest region or Annapurna region. They used to walk from one village to the other and stay with the villagers basically. But now those villagers eventually started coming up with a tea house or a lodge, which was open for trekkers to come and spend the night, and they would give them some food and things like that. So if you're doing one of these tea house treks, you typically don't need a porter. And if you're familiar, or if you're comfortable with the language, sometimes you don't need a guide as well. Of course, having a guide or an instructor even with you makes the trip that much more engaging and fulfilling and knowledgeable. So that's the advantage. But on a tea house trek, you just carrying your own personal effects. You reach the tea house or village at the end of the day, you get your food, you get a nice warm bed to sleep in. Sometimes not so nice, but you're assured that you'll get a sleeping bag or a clean bed to sleep in. Yeah. Whereas in India, we don't have too many options of doing these tea house treks, because that culture has not sort of picked up yet. It is slowly picking up in certain parts of Himachal and Uttarakhand, but in the rest of the country, maybe not that developed yet. So what happens for treks in India? Usually we have to have a full team with us, where you are carrying your tents, your sleeping bags, all your food, your water, and all your whatever equipment is required. And the instructor or the guide walks along with the trekkers and the support team and the porters, whether it's on yaks or whether it's a porter, a person who's carrying your the luggage, or whether it's a mule who's carrying your luggage. You have the mule train maybe sometimes, and the team moves up and they set up camp. By the time the trekker gets there, the camp is ready, and then you spend the night in the camp. You're given your food and everything. So just basic things to look out for in trekking is that number one is your safety aspects. So you'll be very surprised to know that a lot of trekking related deaths occur, and maximum number of those, maybe more than a third of those deaths, are because of acclimatization problems, altitude sickness and things like that. So there are very specific rules regarding acclimatization, and typically when you reach an altitude of 3,500 meters, your acclimatization rules start from there, and you're supposed to have rest days, and you're not there is a certain maximum amount of elevation that you can gain for that particular day. So safety aspects are paramount, of course. And while doing treks, just like you wouldn't want to drive an F1 car as soon as you learn how to drive, you should not be attempting to go to Everest as soon as your first or your second trek. You should slowly build up your capability and capacity. So first of all, you will understand what it takes to walk on different types of terrain. Sometimes you'll have gravel, sometimes you'll have big rocks, sometimes you'll have mud and snow, sometimes you'll have tree roots, sometimes you'll have broken pieces of pavement or stones and things like that. So it makes sense to, sorry, it makes sense to kind of, is that visible? Yeah, okay. So it makes sense to build up your capacity slowly, go for a shorter, easier trek, which is not taking place at a very high altitude first, and then slowly build up your capacity. First of all, you have to enjoy it. If you don't enjoy it, then you're not going to be, you wouldn't want to do it as well. And why would you do a trek? So like I said, the trekking destination depends on what you want to see. Number one, why do we go to these regions? It's because if you want to go see Mount Everest, you can't simply drive up in a car over there. Although now you can take a helicopter, but believe me, it's far more satisfying to walk to a place like that than, you know, have a fleeting glimpse out of an aircraft or a car or a bus or a truck or, you know, a train, something like that. Second is people who want to improve their fitness. Trekking, a lot of these activities, in fact, mountain biking, of course, scuba, of course, but trekking especially is one of my favorite ways to, you know, get some fitness, because on a trek, it's very, you might be going to the gym on a daily basis, or you might be running on a treadmill very regularly, but on a trek, it's very different when you are exposed to the elements, to the rain, to the cold, to sleeping on the ground, uh, to, you know, just that rough punishment that your knees and your legs and your ankles are getting every day. It kind of builds up a amazing fitness, which is coming organically. It's not that you're having to do the same sort of, when you're in a gym, you are, of course, you know, working on your fitness, but you're in a controlled environment. There is no like sunlight, or there is no heat, or there is no rain falling on you. Here, the because you're exposed to the elements and you're fighting against those elements to make it up to your destination, you build a very different kind of fitness. So that's always one of the it's like a big bonus of one of the treks, of doing a trek rather. There anything else? Yeah, of course. Just seasons. Just a couple of other things to watch out for regarding trekking. In the Himalayas, the thumb rule is that you get the best skies immediately after the rainy season. When the rains kind of wash away all the dust and impurities from the atmosphere, you get the most amazing skies and the clearest, you know, views. So when you're going to Everest, if it's covered in clouds, or if you're going to see a particular river, or if you're going to see a particular hill or a mountain, and you don't see the mountain because of it's overcast, then that has got to be the most disappointing thing, and that will inevitably happen. But the thumb rule is after the rainy season, you get the best skies, especially in winter. If you can bear that cold, the winter skies are always the clearest, without a doubt. However, a lot of the time in that autumn and fall season after the rains, you will not find snow. So if you want to be walking in a place where there is a lot of snow, that's before the rains. So around February, March, April is where you'll see a lot of snow. So in a lot of cases, the same trail, which will be fully covered in, you know, 5, 6, 7, 10 feet of snow in, say, February or March, when you go on that same trail in say November, it'll be October, November, it'll be completely dry. Yeah, I think that's about it. So we good? We can close it. I think I'm
Bhagya.
Thank you so much. Yes, I'm here. Thank you so much, Rahul, for a wonderful session. I mean, I'm sure most of our viewers on Facebook and on Zoom will understand and try to identify all the trekking destinations. We did have a few questions on various locations that people wanted to know, but all those questions, while they were sending it to us, it's already covered in your presentation itself. So your holistic perspective about adventure sports, in fact, has given us wonderful insight. And before we conclude, I would like to request Abel George, who's been the coordinator for this event, to please share his views on the same. Abel, just a minute. Let me mute you. Yeah, good to go, Abel.
Yeah. Hello, Rahul. First of all,
Hi.
Thanks for a wonderful session.
Yep.
So we didn't know that there were so many sports in India which you could actually rush your adrenaline like this. So it was very informative. And coming from this, on the behalf of Decathlon and Brigade Road, I thank you for this wonderful session. And on behalf of our users also, thanks for inspiring us.
Thanks.
And looking
Thanks.
forward to do more workshops in the coming day, in the future days.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me. Yeah. Thanks for
Yeah.
this. And it's a great platform. So thanks a lot.
So thank you so much, Abel. And Rahul, since it's a digital session, of course, we have physical constraints to hand over this to you. So we would digitally like to appreciate this.
Thank you.
Especially in recognition of your valuable adventurous endeavors and achievements. Your tales of skydiving, trekking, skiing, mountain biking, scuba diving, and all adventure sports have definitely inspired us a lot. And through your narrations, we are sure that you have imparted the importance of trusting one's ability to achieve dreams in life. And your tales have definitely unfolded diverse virtues of youth life.
Thanks
so
for
rest
having
assured
me,
that
guys.
your
Really appreciate
courage
it.
and your determination definitely sets a vital illustration for mankind. And I'm sure by the time we have a next workshop, you should have a lot of our users, a lot of our viewers sharing their experience on how they explored adventure sports with your knowledge. Thank you so much once again, Rahul. So thank you so much, everyone. And thank you so much, Sijo and Abel, for making this event possible.
Thank you, Bhagishi. Thanks a lot. Thanks, Sijo.
Possible for us to open your camera for a moment, who all are not there, Karan, Sagar, just for a moment, so that I can take a group photo. Okay, 1, 2, 3, go. Done. So Bhagya is coming right now. Okay, one more.
Okay.
Okay. See you all.
Bye. Thank you so much, everyone. Thanks a lot.